Hello and welcome. We're trying to add to the introduction that we've already placed on the Christ Logos website. We'll be adding in this particular entry chapters 1, 2, and 3 of the book The Modern Christian Mystic. Slowly we'll be adding all of the chapters until the whole book is lectured online. On behalf of my wife, Carol, I'd like to apologize for the condition of my charts, which are nearly illegible, but hopefully with some explanation from me, they'll make some sense as we approach them. So the first chapter is called The Silence of God. And in traditional Catholic theology, I'm not sure about Protestant or Orthodox theology, there is this notion of the ontological chasm between the human and God. And it's always appeared peculiar to me, even as when I was going through my theological training, it was always a peculiar approach to theology. And what was needed then, which is really probably provided by St. Paul, was a corresponding idea that we are the adopted children of God, always leaving us with this sense of some form of separateness. While none of that makes sense mystically in any of the traditions, all the mystical traditions have the same understanding of, in fact, ontological oneness, oneness at the level of being. Ontos is Greek for being. So the ontological oneness is the very core understanding, whether it's Buddhist mysticism, or in particular Taoist mysticism, or any other form. There is always this sense, as in the Hindu dyad, the oneness of the realized oneness of the Atman, the individual soul, with Brahman, the mystery of both manifest and non-manifest reality. So what I'm making the case for here is the only ontological chasm that actually does exist is that the difference between the size of the part and the whole. None of it, we are all theoretically expandable to the whole, but that in fact is never really realized, well, other than in incarnations such as Krishna or Jesus Christ or Gautama Buddha. But in the case of most of us, there is a theoretical endlessness to spiritual growth, but a de facto limitation. None of us becomes the whole, or few of us in human history actually achieve that total oneness. So there still is the sense of a kind of difference in dimension rather than difference in kind. So you have, again, that concept that I've mentioned a lot that comes out of the Buddhism of Nichiren Daishonin, who is later taught by Daisaku Ikeda, who's alive now in Japan, or at least was the last I knew. The idea that the self that I am and the self of the universe is the same self. Now, having said it's the same self does not mean that every single one of us is realized as the size of the universe, either infracosmically or transcendent of the cosmos. So the being of God is being itself. And that's why this idea of this built-in separation that needs to be transcended by adoption always seems to me, and still does seem to me, although I guess it sort of makes me a heretic on some level, it seems to me a mechanism for accomplishing that which it denies. So you start out by denying the ontological oneness, and then you create a mechanism that makes that possible. And what that does is it guarantees the hegemony of the hierarchy in Christianity. It always leaves the individual with the sense that there is something else that needs to be done, some greater clarity that needs to be achieved in order for oneness to be experienced. And that's simply not true. And I think that was the great strength of the Protestant Reformation, was the claim that the individual is fully capable of union with God on his or her own terms, and directly unmediated by any hierarchical or theological construct. So the being that really is expressed in the individual is what I keep referring to as the fourth voice. Because our being and the being of God is one being, the voice that we hear as the brain mind is allowed to quiet down is directly the voice of God, and that might be heard as Aum, or it might be heard in some other way as it manifests through the actual structures of the human brain and is realized within the context of an incarnate being with a triune brain. So, in other words, there is the fourth voice itself, which is experienced as the cosmic, and even transcendent of the cosmic, the transcosmic voice of God. But there is also the fourth voice as it expresses itself in cognition, in affect, and in instinct. So there are different ways in which we experience it, because we are a dimension of it, and it speaks through us. In each of the four ways. So, my very sad drawing up here tries to express some of this in visual form, and actually it does look a little busy, But all I was trying to say, you'll notice there are these intersecting sets of dotted lines. On this side is the eternal or transcendent dimension of the consciousness that is God, erupting into a temporal or immanent expression of it. And in between, another dotted line going up here represents the event horizon of space-time. As the eternal consciousness crosses over the event horizon of space and time, it is expressed as the space-time continuum, as well as the energy-matter or energy-material continuum. And then that comes to us in Christianity. Our first realization of it is as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I added in blue Brahman, the Vishnu Shiva incarnation, and that's actually supposed to be Krishna, mistake. It's a Vishnu, Krishna, and Shiva. And it's really not to say that the Hindu Trinity is the same as the Christian Trinity, because it really isn't. It's only to say that there is an expression of Trinity on both, in the main traditions of both cultures, both as Catholicism and as Vaishnava Hinduism. And then I just added from that, in our mystical understanding as Christians, because that's what this is about, the modern Christian mystic. Then there is the Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and the indigenous cultures, all as emanations of this immanence, this temporal immanence. So each of them being expressions of, and in a sense containers of, eternity and divinity. So that's all this is trying to articulate visually. And I think there's a clear need for some more professional posters to be made. Okay, so the point here is that consciousness precedes the event horizon, and it is consciousness that flows over the event horizon as space-time, so that there is nothing that isn't consciousness. And that's the point, that there is no ontological separation, that all there is God. It really comes down to what we call God. There is nothing that isn't God, either prior to the emergence of the universe or subsequent to it, in past, present, or in future terms. There is only the presence of divinity, certainly in our self-understanding when that becomes imminent. So the silence of God, then, is this consciousness. And that's why the book begins, chapter 1, with the silence of God. The silence of God is mentioned theologically in other contexts as when God grows silent, when God doesn't hear us, in such horrible places as Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. I remember the story, I think it's from Elie Wiesel's Night, where a 10-year-old boy is being hanged as retribution for somebody escaping from the camp, and somebody in the crowd says, well, where is God now? And the rabbi, or whoever else it was, responds, he's hanging from the rope. The boy couldn't die because he didn't have enough weight to snap his own neck. And so he dangled there. And the silence is referred to sometimes as the silence of God, God's refusal to speak. Well, that's not what's meant here. What's meant here is the beingness of God, that as the very enlightened human being that made that statement there, that in fact the silence was the presence of God, that God was dangling from the rope. So I'm hoping that that does a little bit to illuminate chapter 1, and the viewer is asked his or her indulgence, along with the promise that the next time these are done, perhaps we'll have some better charts with which to do it. So then chapter 2 is actually referring to what goes on right here, for the Christian, not for the Jew or the Muslim or Buddhist, Hindu, or anyone else, but for the Christian. What then emerges from transcendence in silence becomes a triunal understanding by the time we get to the Christian scriptural corpus, the four Gospels in particular. There'll be a retrospective understanding that God represents the divine self as Father, as Son, and as Holy Spirit. And as I mentioned in the other presentations at the church, that the real meaning of pneuma, or spirit, is a feminine noun. And this, I think that we would have had a much more wholesome sense of the Trinity if it really did represent the Holy Family as Father, Son, and Mother. Then there would be a cosmic, playing on that image and likeness, there would be a cosmic counterpart for the human Holy Family that included Jesus. There would be, and it would be more clearly a manifestation of that which is Father, Son, and Mother, much more so than Father, Son, and Second Son, or whatever. But anyway, that is more my own sense of how it ought to be, rather than in fact how it is. So then the second chapter is we look again now, we're looking at the notion of the Trinity itself. And oddly enough, we could, in my obvious love of foursomes, these for this and for that I continually present, another way we could talk about the fourth voice is to say, if voice 1 was the Father, voice 2 was the Son, and voice 3 was the Holy Spirit, voice 4 would be the transcendence of the Trinity. It would be the return to oneness, the return to experiential oneness, because there is a kind of theological fracturing in our experience of Christianity that takes place by defining it as Father, Son, and Spirit. To repeat, I think that would be more healthy or whole if it were Father, Mother, and Son. But in any case, the transcendence of the three different persons into oneness again would represent the emergence of a fourth voice spirituality, a transcendent spirituality that returns to an experiential silence that would represent the eternal or transcendent. And that's why I frequently say, and I say so in the book as well, that we can actually, regardless of what physics can or can't do within its disciplines, that experientially we can move back and forth over that event horizon in meditation. And we can receive experience, if not messages from, the dark side of the universe, or the universe prior to there being a universe. In other words, the mind of God, the consciousness that precedes the universe. So it's important in that understanding, again, for the modern Christian mystic to understand that the Trinity is not three pieces of God. There are, and I used that H2O when I delivered the original lecture, that H2O might be experienced in its water personality, in its ice personality, or its steam personality. But in fact, all of those are transcended at the root by it being water, it being one thing with three different manifestations, and possibly more than three. The Hindus are frequently accused of being polytheists, and of course they're not. They just have more aspects, in the same way that the Christian would pray to a saint as a kind of sunbeam of divinity from the original core of the sun. The Hindu sees many, many manifestations of divinity and gives them all names. But they all go back to the mystery prior to the beginning, which is immanent throughout, and that is Brahman. And the understanding is that the human soul is ontologically one with Brahman, and that's the whole purpose of spirituality, is to realize that, to make that happen in experience. And I don't know how many times I think it needs to be repeated that the word realized only means experienced. It's the difference between knowing about and knowing. And really, all of the mystical corpus over the centuries from all traditions could be reduced to that simple understanding, is that we go from knowing about to knowing directly. St. Paul articulates that in some point where he says, we see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see and be seen face to face. The problem with a lot of Paul's metaphors is they set up dualities that are really not necessary. Like, that sounds like there is an observer and an observed, but there really isn't. There is only consciousness. And the realization that what we actually are is consciousness is the leap. So we thus experience the whole as we experience that dimension of the whole, which is our own differentiated being. So, I made myself a note here to read a little bit from page 7 of the book, and so I'm going to do that now. I was talking about, I said, the return to the Trinity. To return to the Trinity, God does not have three pieces or parts. God is expressed as many. The three persons are best understood as three dynamics of the one, of the whole being of God. We often experience ourselves in a similar way. The reason I made the note to myself to read this is because it's a nice, simple way to ground our understanding in a very simple experience that we've all had. I'm one person on the job, another with my family, and still another in the woods with my dog. And yet I'm me all the time and in all places. And we've all had that experience where even when we really know each other and are married, there you are, you're working on your job, you're interacting with the people that you're used to working to, and then your spouse shows up. And it's like, and suddenly, it's not that you've done anything wrong, it's just that you're knocked off balance because we have different facets of ourselves that express ourselves in different ways, in different dimensions in our lives. And that's a way to think about Trinity, as one God expressed in various different ways. And the Hindus would just say that, you know, there are at least 250,000 of those at last count. So probably by now there are 250,005 different dimensions of the way in which God is made manifest. And of course there are as many small g gods as there are existents, E-N-T-S. Each of us represents another icon or symbol through which the divine light shines in its different way, where each of us are kind of different prism. So then also on page 7, I quote from the scriptures, and it's the first time in the book. Most of you have heard me say this 100 times, probably ad nauseum at this point, but it's the quote from John's Gospel where Philip says to Jesus, "Lord, show us the Father, and then we shall be satisfied." Jesus said to him, "Have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still do not know me?" These are the sentences that get him nailed to a tree. You still do not know me? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, "Show us the Father"? Do you now believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? That last sentence is the explanation that in the same way that the sponge is in the water is in the sponge. It is not saying that the sponge is the water. It's saying that which the water is in the sponge. I am the same stuff that the Father is. And that's repeated in all the other traditions in different ways. And that's why we know that that's what he meant, because he's Oriental. And it's so important to grasp that. Becky and I are going to do a pretty serious job in the book that's coming out next year at this time, 2009, on the Gospel of John. It's now called The Way to Christ, The Way of Christ, Roman numeral 1. And we're going to work on, Becky and I are working on an introduction and a preface that will articulate the need to understand Jesus of Nazareth as Guru manifesting the Christ Logos. And that what we call Christianity has sadly, in some way, really atrophied the grandeur of what was really being said there, and wrapped it all up after separating from the Jews, from Jewish theology, winding up really recapitulating the same problem by reifying Jesus as the second person of the Trinity, as opposed to understanding his self-understanding of his own divinity as not the ego of Jesus of Nazareth, but the transcendence of the Christ Logos present within. And I think I talked about that in the next set of talks that I've already presented with regard to Pope John Paul. I mentioned that, didn't I, last time? I talked about seeing Pope John Paul. You went there, did I? Yes. So I won't go into that again now. But anyway, I guess the reader is teased, rather the viewer is teased to watch the next installment, because it's already present and we've created in the future. So this whole idea then of the ontological chasm is exactly why he died the way he did, is because the accusation was he called himself God. He did not call himself God. He said what God is, he too is. And there is a huge world of difference between that. And in a sense, he died because he was able to come to an understanding of himself that transcended Isaiah's statement. In Isaiah, in chapter 55 of Isaiah, he's speaking as Yahweh, saying, my thoughts are above your thoughts. As far as the sky is above the earth, so are my thoughts above your thoughts, my ways above your ways. Well, what did Jesus die for other than to say, no, your thoughts are my thoughts, and my thoughts are your thoughts. So what he did there was to break the very chasm that goes on being insisted about. And that's always been really peculiar to me. Really peculiar. He bridged a chasm that we keep on insisting is there. And if he couldn't make it clear enough verbally, he did it by transcending death, in order to show that the being that he is eternal, is not caught up in a temporal form, but in fact is able to reemerge, albeit looking differently, because they didn't recognize him on the seashore or on the road to Emmaus or in the upper room, but he reemerged from what would have been called the land of the dead. He reemerges still alive, but in a different way. And so what we see there is a leap over the event horizon. That's really what the resurrection is. He begins as Jesus of Nazareth in time. That form is killed. He descends to the dead and then reemerges in a new way. And so this event horizon of time and space that physics can't transcend is transcended in the resurrection. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. That's why when he's raising Lazarus and he's talking to Lazarus' sister, he says, don't you understand that I am the resurrection? He didn't say, I made the resurrection, or I rose from the dead. He said, I am the resurrection. And that's why his very being, even talking about it, I feel like it reveals itself as we speak. We get a sense in speaking about it of the unbelievable splendor of what it really is that we're talking about. That this temporal form dies into eternity and reemerges again from eternity in time. And then the ascension represents the reemergence yet again into eternity in a different way, in a strange way, in a different direction. when those, for me, right at this time, at this moment, at 25 minutes past 4, here on the 2nd or 3rd or whatever it is of August, it becomes realized in me, even as I speak, and I almost wanted to detour like I'm doing, and just allow myself to go, oh my God, this really is true. It becomes realized over and over and over again, and at different levels of expression. And that's what's happening to me at this very moment is mysticism, is realization. That's exactly what's going on. And typically, whenever I talk about it, I'm sure that's what happened with Christ when the narrator in the Gospels was saying he spoke as one with authority, with authorship, not as the scribes and Pharisees. I'm sure that's what was going on with him, as he became so enraptured in the love of God and how beautiful the whole thing really is, that he went into a different mind. And then later Paul will say, put on the mind of Christ. And it's almost perfectly wrong linguistically. It's more like reveal the mind of Christ, or realize the mind of Christ, and then think with that. Then think with that instead of the brain mind, the three voices of the brain mind. Pushing on from that to chapter 3, which is called the Cosmos, the Sacrament of God. So, if we understand then that the physical universe is really not physical at all, any more than we are. There is a physical dimension to the universe, but the Hindus developed this understanding of that as truly derivative. And that gets really misused when people talk about Hinduism, because they haven't gone into it deep enough to understand what the Hindus are really saying. So they'll say the universe as we see it is Maya. And then that gets rejected by misunderstanding it as saying, well, no, the universe is really here. They're not saying that the universe is not really here. What they're saying is that very here-ness, that concreteness, is itself contingent upon consciousness. That the real truth is this consciousness that manifests itself as space and time, energy and matter. And so, while the piano and the table and the chair and this organism are in fact here, they're obviously here. We're not crazy. We see these various things. But they are contingent. They're derivative. What really is going on here is there is consciousness manifesting through different vibrational rates as different things. So that there is a vibrational rate that represents this being, a vibrational rate that represents that being, a canine, we could say, vibrational rate, a table, a book, a chair, whatever it might be. Each of these are derivative forms of that which really is primary. And that's why Jesus would say, don't worry about those who kill the body. Don't worry about them. Worry about those who are able, through psychotoxins, to destroy the soul, to make the soul sick. Those are the ones to fear. And so he says, don't worry about what you eat or what you clothe yourself with. These are all derivative, and the consciousness that is your Father knows you need them, but don't focus on them. Focus on that which is not derivative, that which is the true foundation of what we experience as a material and energetic universe. Focus on that, because that will provide the rest anyway. Excuse me. And the realization of that is the realization of deathlessness. That's the great wonder, is that once that is actually an experience, there is no more death. There is no more death. There is the breakdown of form. There's no question about that. But with the inability to recognize your father's cocoon-like body, it didn't even look like him. The reason it didn't look like him is because it's not him. Any more than this particular cocoon will look like the person that is interacting. Because what you're really seeing is my soul. And what we loved in your father was his soul. And that cocoon is just the soil, air, water, and light from the solar system that will just become organic compounds again. And in fact, through his wise decision to just have a wicker basket, so much the quicker. That's why I want to have this put into the soil, so that as soon as I can become part of the life systems again, then once again, as I like to put it, I'm nourishing the corn. I'm giving what the corn gave to me, what the New Hampshire corn gave to this form, is given back to the corn. Where am I? Right here, where I've always been. Right here. There's nowhere to go. And that's why Jesus would say, the kingdom of heaven is in your midst. That's the whole reason for saying that, is because it is. Here we are in it. And the moment of realization is a moment in heaven, a moment in eternity, that then we return to our place in time. We return to being the beings that, people know us as, with all the irritabilities and failings and all of that. But then, again, we're given that taste of eternity again, and that's where we are back home. And that's why we're in heaven, and that's why heaven is in our midst. So the cosmos, then, is a sacrament. And all other sacraments lead back to the cosmos itself for their efficacy, for their meaning. What is the meaning of baptism with dirty water? What's the meaning of confirmation if there's no fire? What's the meaning of the Holy Spirit, the symbol of the dove, if the birds are dead? What is the meaning? Our symbolism simply disappears. It evaporates, and we live in a world without symbol. And when we live in a world without symbol, we live in a flattened universe, and that's just where we find ourselves. We find ourselves in a world of evaporating meanings. And we walk around trying to draw too much meaning from our relationships, too much meaning from our flags, too much meaning from the ego identity of a particular religious tribe. We're trying to derive too much meaning. Why? Because we're living in a flattened world. We're living in a world that's losing its ability to transmit meaning as sacrament. And that's why, much to the chagrin of many of my colleagues over the years, they'd say things like, Albert, you're obviously a very intelligent guy, and we've been thinking about this one question. We don't quite know how to ask you, but why do you continue in Christianity? And my answer always is, I continue in Christianity because of the Eucharist. That's why I continue in Christianity, because Christianity provides me also with a symbolic life. And that symbolic life is what leads back to the sacramental nature of my own being. So I've never been too good for Christianity. I've never been too good for church, because church echoes back to me that which my meditation practice leads me to. And if the Eucharist is what it says it is, it gives me the ability to ingest the consciousness out of which the universe is created in order to recreate me at the quantum level and make me a more fit symbol to transmit the life that is living me. I'm not living life. Life is living me. And that is such a different way to perceive it. Well, I'm living life, and I'm not living life. Life is living me. And my job is to get enough of the me out of the way so that the life shows, so that the life is evident, so that the life is transmitted sacramentally, both infrapsychically to myself, as well as extrapsychically to those around me and to my readers and students and all of that. So I'm going back, I'm reading once again, and again, most of you have heard this many times, is that prologue to John. It's the most peculiar thing in biblical history to me that John is the fourth gospel and not the first, because the first gospel would set us up for the Bethlehem story and provide us with an actual cosmology instead of suddenly, bingo, there's John the Baptist talking, or this whole chain of genealogical history about Jesus, or the Bethlehem story itself. Well, why don't we start here? Why don't we start here so the whole thing is seen as a sacramental manifestation on the part of God, on the part of that eternal consciousness that we are being lived as. So, in the beginning was the Word, and I'm going to substitute consciousness. In the beginning was consciousness, and consciousness was with God, and consciousness was God. And consciousness was with God in the beginning, and through consciousness, all things came into being. Not one thing came into being except through consciousness. And therefore, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and all of them are just other expressions of what I think of as Christianity. And I'm hoping the Taoist, in return, is thinking of Christianity as one of the ways in which the Tao has manifested. Or that the Buddhist is saying, well, Buddha mind manifested also through Christianity and Judaism, and as Allah in Islam. What has come into being from consciousness was life. So now we've moved from eternity to energy, matter, and now life emerges as the sacred among us, as the manifestation of God's actual presence. And life was the light of all people. And that light shines in darkness, and the darkness cannot overpower it. And so thereby any description, if guru means dispeller of darkness, then what we have there is the statement very clearly that at least John's understanding of who Jesus was the dispeller of darkness, and therefore guru. Or to use the Eastern Christian word, starets. So there is this progression: consciousness, cosmos, earth, life, culture, and the individual. This is what Thomas Berry, my teacher, called the new story. Except he left out the most important element in the whole thing, which was consciousness preceding. He stayed with physics to the extent that he didn't allow himself, as a product of time and space, to assert that consciousness preceded time and space. Until now, in his old age, he came to tell me that that univocal language that doesn't have all those multiplicities of meaning and of depth, is actually impairing the efficacy of the new story. And really, in a nutshell, what it comes down to is that univocal language is language without God. Trivocal language would be language with God. or multivocal would be the language of all those multiplicities of meaning that come pouring out when we don't limit ourselves to scientific descriptions because we don't have to. We do if we're physicists, and I think that's legitimate. I think it's okay to have strictures around particular disciplines because each of them are lenses through which to look at as long as you don't miss out on the oneness out of which they all emerge. If you miss that, you really have thrown out the baby with the bathwater. So, the presence of the one is in every one of the many. The presence of the one is in each and every one of the many, undivided and complete. And the high Christian theology really makes that clear very well. They say that, you know, in an experience of the Holy Spirit, you experience the Father and the Son. In the experience of the Son, you experience the Father and the Holy Spirit. In the experience of the Father, you experience the Son and the Holy Spirit. That it's all, that any experience on the part of any one of the many, which we are, is an experience of the whole and the one. So then, to draw this to a close here and open it up for some questions, I'm coming up, the last thing I'd like to say are what physics calls the four forces, which are gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, which holds the atom together, and the weak nuclear force, which allows it to, well, it's radioactivity. It allows the cell to break down, represents the four, in a sense, character traits of the universe, the way the universe acts. But what's missing, and why that remains univocal, or what Ken Wilber would call flatland, is that consciousness is really the first of five. And that in the search for the grand unified theory, the consciousness that seeks the theory is the proof of the theory. The fact that we hunger for a grand unifying theory is the most obvious and not very subtle indication that we are the consciousness that we seek. So there are five forces, and Teilhard de Chardin really tried to get to this in Christianity. He's a paleontologist, and he's a Catholic mystic. And he tried to get to it by writing his books called Human Energy and the Activation of Human Energy, where he's talking about love, the presence of love as a universal force. And so that becomes a metaphor for consciousness for me. That there are really five forces. Consciousness, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force. And again, the consciousness that seeks the grand unified theory is the grand unified theory. In other words, human. The human consciousness that seeks it is the same human consciousness that sought monotheism. And it's no mistake that the whole doctrine of a universe and of and the whole source for the search for a grand unified theory would come out of the monotheistic West. That the West would take at some level of assumption that it's all one, and that one is God. So lastly, in closing, I'm going to close it the same way I closed it when we did it in the church, is to indicate that there are three major dynamics that lead to realization in this context. The first is emptying, confession. Because in emptying, in the whole sacramental approach to confession is so trivialized in mainline Christianity that we've really lost the efficacy, and in losing the efficacy of the sacrament of emptying, we lose the realization that's on the other side of it. That's the terrible tragedy of it all. So then our view of Christianity itself is skewed by the inability to see what it is because we have it emptied. We're looking through a lens that has a crimp in it, and we're wondering why it's not so self-evident. So the very first need is to find a methodology for radical emptying and to be willing to do it. And no one likes it, because what it is consciousness confronting the ego. And that's painful for everybody. To admit the smallness of our behaviors, the smallness of our motivations, the self-centeredness of so much of what we do is so contrary to what the ego tells itself about who we are, that it's enormously painful to turn and take a good look, to allow consciousness to kind of go, whoa, and look directly at the ego and say, all right, I got you. I've got you. This is what is really going on. So that's the first one. The second one, following the emptying, is the refilling of the space left with Eucharist, with consciousness itself, with the sacred meal that is present in all traditions. There is always some kind of sacred approach to food in the traditions. And then thirdly, meditation, which for me includes prayer. I often talk about them as two different things, but when I pray my best is when I bring to mind something in the midst of realization, as I'm meditating and really entered into a transcendent state where that which is praying is no longer praying to anyone or anything, but is just praying. Then an understanding of the needs of individuals becomes simply moving consciousness, where the consciousness that we are in meditation then provides something by moving consciousness toward the place where consciousness either is not being experienced or seems to be absent. You notice I say seems to be absent. So, emptying, confession, Eucharist, new consciousness, new food, and meditation, which includes well wishes for those who suffer and those who are going through whatever particular struggles might invade their life. And so what I do, I actually keep a yellow pad near my meditation area, and I list those who have either asked me to remember them, or those whom I just do it anyway because I know they're suffering. And I always then include every client that I've ever had, every student that I've ever had, every reader that I've ever had, everyone who is conceived today, everyone who is born today, everyone who suffers today, and everyone who dies today. And that kind of wraps the whole thing up. So in case I thought I missed anybody, I don't have to remember 3 hours later to think about it. So that is this particular piece, and both for those in the room and those who experience this in the miracle of cyberspace, which is its own mysticism, I thank you for your attention.